Good morning. We are very thankful to have all of you here this morning. Thankful for those of you who are online. We are in our final message in this series called Backstory, 8 Sundays in the story of Ruth. And I hope this series has been encouraging and uplifting for you. I've really been amazed at how much is packed in this little book of Ruth. So next Sunday, we begin a new sermon series in the book of Genesis. We'll be in Genesis for much of the fall. And in that, the sermons will somewhat mirror the curriculum that this new children's class will be using. This new children's class also starts next Sunday at 10 a.m. They'll be in Genesis. The children's church will be in Genesis, and the teen class will be in Genesis. So as a whole church, we'll be walking through some of the formative texts in Genesis together. Also, just want to remind you that next Sunday is our Back to School Sunday. It's a time that we devote some attention and prayer to students and teachers and schools and the launch of that school year. And it's also an opportunity for us to be part of something happening in our community. Next Sunday afternoon is the Walk for Unity and Day of Action. It's hosted by the interfaith community here in Stamford. It's a chance to show unity with those of other faiths, as well as to volunteer with different groups in our local community. You can see the details by clicking on the link in Embrace this last week. So, the book of Ruth. The beginning of the book of Ruth is not the beginning of the story of Ruth. The beginning of the book of Ruth is not the beginning of the story of Ruth. When we come to the beginning of the book of Ruth, Ruth is a grown woman living in Moab. Naomi has a family who's fled from Bethlehem in Judah to Moab. The beginning of the book of Ruth is not the beginning of the story of Ruth. There's a lot more to the story than what we have in that little book. And we're going to lean into that reality this morning, especially when it comes to the hard things of life. Just a quick survey. How many of you have some concern about anxiety, worry, fear, when it comes to something that's happening around the world, something that's been in the news, something at your school, something at your work, something in your family, something in your neighborhood, something in this city? Would you raise your hand if you resonate with any of that? Take a look around. You're not the only one. That's not the whole story. That's not the whole story. And we'll try to lean into that this morning. Now, the author of the book of Ruth may shock us, as we've seen in the series, because the author begins the book of Ruth with pain and loss and despair and grief. Chapter 1, as we've seen in the book, is a chapter of great pain. There's several pain points that come up. There is a famine in the land of Judah that is so severe, that's caused such scarcity of food that Naomi and her family flee Bethlehem in Judah as refugees and go to Moab to try to find food and resources to live on. Another pain point in chapter 1 comes about 10 years later when Naomi's husband dies and Naomi's children die. Naomi is mourning the loss of her husband. Naomi is mourning the loss of her own children. It's hard to fully fathom the level of grief and despair the story begins with when it comes to Naomi. A third point of pain in chapter 1 is the loss of Ruth's own husband. Ruth has married one of the children of Naomi, and now her husband is dead. This wife is mourning the loss of her husband. And apparently over 10 years of marriage, they've not had a child. She has no child to carry on that family. The story begins with pain. And as such, the story of Ruth, the book of Ruth, reminds us that pain is inevitably a part of everyone's story. Sometimes a person's story might begin with pain. There are people who are born into conflicts around the world. There are people who are born into homes that are dysfunctional and toxic. Some people's stories begin in pain. Some of us get to pain somewhere in the middle. Some of us meet it toward the end, but inevitably, pain is a part of every story. And that's why every single one of us, virtually this morning, could raise our hand and say that, yeah, even this week, there are things that create anxiety or fear or worry or concern in our lives, because pain is a part of every story. That's not intended to leave us feeling pessimistic. It's just realistic. What's better? A Bible that says everything's going to be okay, there's never going to be any pain in your life, and then there is. Or a Bible that says, yes, there is pain in the world, there will be pain in your life, and there are ways to live through it. That's what the book of Ruth gives to us. Now, the story of Ruth and the book of Ruth also remind us that the presence of pain in our lives isn't a sign of sin in our lives. Unfortunately, there have been countless preachers over many years who have preached that if there is pain in your life, if there is suffering in your life, if you're a person who could raise your hand this morning, there's something wrong with you. Because if you just had more faith, if you just had less sin, there'd be less suffering in your life. In fact, there are some ancient Jewish commentators who have proposed that the reason that Naomi's husband and children died was because they sinned in leaving Bethlehem and Judah during the famine and going to pagan Moab. They sinned. If they had just had a little more faith and a little less sin, they wouldn't have died. But because they sinned, God killed them. But that is not the testimony of the book of Ruth. The testimony of the book of Ruth is that good and faithful people encounter pain in their lives. But that's not the whole story. And that brings us to the end of the book. So, chapter 4, verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel, and may you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and she went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. This book of Ruth that begins with pain ends with joy and life. A child is born. And everyone in the story knows that this child is a miracle. The narrator stops to tell us that this new life comes into the story by the hand of God himself. It's only the second time in the story that the narrator has told us something directly about God. The rest of the time that we're told things about God, those words are coming through the mouths of other people in the story. But twice in the book of Ruth, the narrator stops to tell us something about God. Once in chapter 1, telling us that God has ended the famine in Bethlehem and Judah. And now in chapter 4, telling us that God has brought about new life. It is a miracle. And the narrator seems to go to lengths to emphasize the obstacles that God overcame to bring hope and new life into this story. There is an analogy drawn between Ruth and Tamar. Tamar's story is told in Genesis chapter 38. Like Ruth, Tamar was an outsider. Like Ruth, Tamar's husband died. Like Ruth, Tamar had no child to carry on the family. Like Ruth, it looked like no one might marry her and give her that child. There were obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And Ruth, it turns out, is related to Tamar by marriage because Tamar is the great grandmother of Boaz, who marries Ruth. And it seems that Ruth's womb is barren. Married presumably for 10 years. In chapter 1, she has no child. And now, having Boaz accept her marriage proposal, we're prepared for a wedding. We're prepared for the newness of that union, but we're not prepared for the way this story ends. The arrival of a child. Against all odds, against all expectations, God breathes new life into this story. In chapter 1, mature lungs begin to breathe their last. In chapter 4, new lungs take their first breath of life. And so in many ways, the book of Ruth is the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of the gospel story of Jesus. Chapter 1 is Friday of the gospel. It is the crucifixion. It is the death. It is the loss. It is the disappointment, the discouragement, and the darkness of it all. Chapters 2 and 3 are like Saturday of the gospel story. They are a time of transition. They are a time of waiting, a time of uncertainty. We're not exactly sure how this is all going to come out. In chapter 4 is Sunday of the gospel story. It's the day of resurrection. It's the day of new life. It's the day that we never imagined could be. Hope and joy arrive in the story of Ruth. And so what the book of Ruth is revealing in the way that it ends is that, yes, pain is a part of every story. It is inevitable in human life, but it is never the whole story. And that joy and life are the goal toward which God is moving every story. Against all odds, in the face of insurmountable obstacles, the goal toward which God was moving the story of Ruth was joy and hope and new life. And what's true of the story of Ruth is true of every person's story here. Frank, I want to say to you that the pain that you're experiencing, even in this very moment, is not the whole story. There is more to your story than that. And that the goal he is moving your story toward is the goal of hope and new life and resurrection. And that is true for every single person in this room. What a good word that is for us as we approach another September 11th. That moment in history that seemed so marked by loss and pain and grief and darkness and despair and confusion is not the whole story. And even in that story, God's goal is to move toward hope and newness of life. What a good word this is. For those of us who have been living through COVID, 6.5 million people have died of this disease. 70,000 in the state of New York, 11,000 in the state of Connecticut. Jobs have been lost. Many of us have been financially impacted by this disease. Some of us have long-term health impacts because of this disease. It is certainly a milestone for us in this generation, but that is not the whole story. There is more to our story than that. And even in that story, God is moving toward hope and newness of life. What is really remarkable in the book of Ruth is that in the book, as in the gospel, hope and new life arrive in the form of a child. This child is born to Ruth and to Boaz, something that no one could have ever predicted. And that child goes on, we're told, to eventually give birth to a child named David. And as we know, on the other side of that story, because the story continues after the book of Ruth ends, that child goes on until we get to the birth of the child, Jesus. In the gospel, as in the book of Ruth, hope and new life arrive in the person of a child. And what a good word that is for us. As schools get back into session, as we launch a new class for children next Sunday, these are stories that remind us that investing in children, prioritizing children, nurturing children, caring for children, accompanying children, parenting children is one of the most vital things that we can do in our human lives. Because children carry the weight of the hopes of God. Children are part of the way that God continues to unfold His ultimate goal for every human on the planet, hope and newness of life. And so let me invite you in these closing moments in silence to consider these three questions, to consider which of these might resonate with you in this moment. Is there a pain in my life that I've allowed to overshadow the rest of my story? Are there some ways in which I've forgotten that that is not the whole story? Or two, what new life and joy is God making possible right now in my life? And third, this week, how might I invest in a child as part of joining God in His unfolding plans for our world?